And I brought this. This is a little book that I wrote, and I didn't know whether you could use this or not. I don't have any more copies of it, but it's an interesting little thing.
Okay. Yeah, sure. So the date is March 11th, 2022 at the Brenedy Assisted Living Facility in Daphne, Alabama. And Captain, could you state your full name for the record?
Jack Caldwell.
And I take it, like a lot of men born back then, you didn't have a middle name or initial.
Well, I did have a middle name, but I didn't use it in the Navy. My middle name is Martin, but I didn't use it when I got in the Navy. Martin.
And when were you born, Captain?
1924, 10th of August, 1924.
And just for the record, you can see that we're recording this conversation.
Right.
Do you have any issues with it being recorded?
Not at all. No.
Do you have any instructions or restrictions for how you would like this material to be used?
No, it's not. How's it going? I didn't know how it's going to be used.
So the way we normally do it is we have an area in our library that's just oral histories. And so usually we have one copy in that. And then if you have any family members or you would like to have a copy for your own use, we will provide one for you if you want one.
Yeah, sure, I'd like to have a copy. But
Okay.
I don't know that anybody else would need one.
All right, so you said you were born in 1924. Where were you born?
On the family farm near Lucasville, Ohio.
And did you also grow up in Lucasville, or did your family relocate?
Yes, we lived in the area around Lucasville in southern Ohio, Portsmouth, Ohio, southern Ohio, yeah. And I went to school there, and then, of course, I ended up going to school at Ohio State.
And so, obviously, your father would have been a farmer.
Just a farmer, yeah. And the family farm, my father, my grandfather, my great-grandfather, and my great-great-grandfather, who was an officer in the Civil War. So we were all attached to that farm in southern Ohio. They were livestock farmers. They farmed cattle, pigs, white, black-faced sheep, etc. They were just called, they farmed animals for sale. Sheep, cattle, pigs.
And what was the size of your family? Did you have a lot of siblings?
I have one sister, and then my mother was married before, and so I have a half-brother.
Now, obviously, one thing we like to ask people about is what it was like growing up during the Depression. And I had a farm family. That was my father's background. And I know that farmers tended to do a little bit better than a lot of other people because they were growing their own food. Is that your family's experience?
Yes, pretty much so, yeah. They were self-sufficient, you know. They didn't really need to buy very much stuff because they grew everything, and they had livestock. They had chickens and pigs and everything, you know, to sustain a family. They did pretty well, probably better than a lot of people during the Depression who lived in the city and didn't have access to livestock and chickens and stuff, you know.
Do you have any strong memories from that period of your life? For example, work you had to do on the farm to help out or anything like that?
Well, we raised saddle horses, and my father was big on horses, and his father and grandfather and everybody were all horse people. They raised saddle horses, and I remember as a teenager I had to ride and train horses before I got on the school bus to go to school. So I did a lot of horse riding.
So obviously you actually managed to have up through a high school education because you got to go to college. What sort of studies did you have before you got into college?
Actually, it was just a regular country high school, and they specialized in athletics, and they didn't do much in the studious stuff, you know. They were big on athletics, basketball, etc.
Were there any particular athletics that you took part in?
I was a basketball player. As it turns out, I was about one of the tallest kids in school, so of course they had me playing basketball.
Well, now you said they focused more on athletics than academics, but out of the subjects that you did take, were there any that you were particularly good at or enjoyed?
I was always good at history. I liked history.
Any particular part of history or just
Well,
general?
the family talked a lot about the Civil War. My great-grandfather was an officer in the Civil War. He was wounded at Lynchburg, took a bullet at Lynchburg, and he died a month later in the hospital. So they talked a lot about the Civil War, the family did.
Now, during your time growing up, did you have any sort of exposure to aircraft or to flight? Did you have any sort of...
Not really,
Not
no.
really.
No.
So you said after that you got to go to Ohio State, is that right?
Yeah.
What were you studying at Ohio State?
Well, I was always studying history, and I concentrated on history with a secondary interest in American and English literature.
And is that where you were when World War II started?
Yes, we lost the farm during the Depression, and my father was older and he had trouble finding work. So we moved around a lot in southern Ohio while my father was trying to find work. He was just a farmer, and so when he lost the farm, things were hard for him. So we moved around a lot while my father looked for work. But, you know, everybody else had a hard time during the Depression, so I couldn't complain about anything really.
So were you in college when the news was reported that Japan had bombed Pearl Harbor?
No, I wasn't. I was, my father still raised horses, and we had several horses in the barn, and I had to exercise them every morning, first thing, you know, before I got on the school bus. So actually I was riding one of the horses, and my mother came out and took the reins and held the reins, and she looked up at me, and I was sitting on the horse, and she looked up at me and she said, "Jackie, do you know where a place called Pearl's Harbor is?" I said, "No, Mother, I don't." So she said, "Well, let's go listen to the radio," because she said, "The Japs have attacked a place called Pearl's Harbor." So that's how everything started, you know, then.
Did you have any awareness prior to that of what was going on in Europe, or was that something that people really didn't?
Yeah, that was sort of beyond we were busy taking care of local stuff, you know. So no, we weren't paying much attention to anything outside the country.
So how old were you when that happened, when the war actually started?
I was 17 going on 18.
So when did you make the decision to enlist? What prompted you to do that?
Early on, because all the young men in Southern Ohio, they all enlisted. Everybody enlisted, so I signed up as a naval aviation cadet in 1942, and I was commissioned in the Navy in 1944 at Pensacola. that's where I got my wings in 1944 at Pensacola.
What prompted you to join the Navy as opposed to some other service?
Actually, we were getting a lot of publicity about the war in the Pacific, and you know, they had a big battle at Midway, and we lost all the planes. And so I just thought that it looked like it'd be an interesting thing to be in the Navy, flying off a carrier. So that's why I enlisted in the Navy.
So when you enlisted, what was the first thing that happened to you after? Do you remember where you enlisted, like that
Yeah,
process?
I enlisted in Columbus, Ohio. Post office in Columbus, Ohio.
And did they take you right away, or did you have to spend some time waiting?
Yeah, I had to wait. I enlisted in the fall, and I had to wait till in the spring of like '43 before they called me up. They called me up to a cadet program flying with the aim that eventually we would get commissioned at Pensacola. So I had to wait over the winter until they called me in the spring of '43.
In the time that you were waiting, did they give you any exposure to flight through the civilian pilot training program or anything like that, or was it just waiting?
Just waiting, yeah, just waiting until they would call me for slots that were open in the aviation cadet program.
So once you finally got called up, do you remember leaving home? Was that the first time you'd ever been away from home?
Pretty much true, yeah. They had a big gang of family and friends as I got on the train there in southern Ohio to go to. The Navy was calling everybody into Detroit, where they were allotted to various training programs.
And so where did you go for your initial training? I mean, I guess you had to do pre-flight at some point.
Yeah, pre-flight. I went to a little college called Worcester College in Ohio, and then I went to Ohio State for a semester, and then I ended up in Pensacola to start flying.
And was there anything about that process before you actually got to Pensacola to start your, I guess that would have been your primary flight? Mm-hmm. Was there anything in the process up to that point that you found particularly challenging, or did you feel like you adapted to it very well?
I seem to have a natural ability for, I was not overwhelmed by the being in the Navy and being required to fly aircraft. I seem to take to it easily. I didn't have any trouble with aircraft. So.
At that point, did you have some idea what type of aircraft you would like to fly, or were you just wanting to fly anything they would put you in?
Yeah, sort of. But everybody wanted to be a fighter pilot, and they graded us by the instructor's sense of how skillful we were. And so evidently I was not considered skillful enough to be a fighter pilot, so I became a torpedo plane pilot.
So once you got to Pensacola for your primary flight training, what sort of aircraft were you flying at that time?
We flew the SNJ. We flew another aircraft called an SNV. And of course, the old Stearman, the old biplane, that was a lot of our aerobatics were done in the Stearman. But you couldn't pull the wings off of it, I figured that's why they did it. It was a great airplane.
So I've got to ask you, in that entire curriculum, were there any types of maneuvers or things that you were required to do that gave you some trouble that you had to do remedial periods for?
No, I seem to not have any trouble with meeting all the requirements. The Navy was really big on all sorts of difficult flying. They had you flying, doing inverted spins and all kinds of stuff, you know, to make sure that you wouldn't be surprised by anything bad happening when you were flying. So I thought the Navy had a very good training program and lined up for guys like me that were just, I had never done any kind of flying before, you know. So I thought the Navy did a good job training us.
And you said you got your wings in 44 at Pensacola.
Uh-huh.
How did you feel about that when they pinned them on you?
Yeah, well, I was quite impressed because they were, they had French, British, they had several nationalities all there getting the Navy wings. Because evidently getting the Navy wings by foreigners like the French and the British, our Navy wings were greatly admired, and everybody wanted to wear the gold wings of the Navy, which I fell into.
So once you finished your training at Pensacola, where did they send you next?
They sent me to a squadron. My first squadron was in Seattle, Washington, and this was the first squad, VC 76. It was in Seattle, Washington.
So you got there very early on, before they even got on the Petroff Bay. So once you got into the squadron, and I've got a list of all the places that they were, Clatsop County, Oregon. Does that ring a bell? That's
Actually, Coos Bay.
Coos Bay.
Coos Bay was where the Naval Air Station was.
And then Holtville.
I don't know that name, no.
And then the last one I had for them was Los Alamitos, but those are both in California.
I don't really remember that.
Okay. Let's talk about the two places you do remember, Seattle and Coos Bay. What was it like? This would have been your advanced training at this point?
Yeah.
What was it like doing your advanced training in the Pacific Northwest?
It was, I thought it was easy, you know. We did all sorts of combat type squadron flying where you flew very close, you know, in a unit, you know, 4 planes in a unit. And that was challenging, you know, because you were always tucked in tight on somebody. So I thought the Navy had a good program to make sure you could handle any situations that you got into.
So at that point, were you flying TBMs?
Yes, yeah.
What was your opinion of the TBM as an aircraft?
An absolutely fantastic airplane. Yeah, I mean, it was, we called it the Grumman Iron Works because with their airplanes, like the F-6 fighter, they were so rugged that the Navy called them from the Grumman Iron Works. They were wonderful aircraft. The Turkey, we called the TBM the Turkey. It never quit. It had a terrific engine. So it was a wonderful airplane to get introduced to because us neophytes that were prone to making little mistakes while the airplane took care of us.
Were there any challenges in trying to fly an aircraft that was that big?
No, not really. And it was, you know, it was probably the biggest single-engine airplane that the U.S. government produced during that time, you know. It was a whopping big airplane. But totally reliable. Hardly anything ever went wrong with it. And as long as you didn't make any mistakes, why, you were in good shape with that airplane. A great airplane.
Now, I did look at the squadron history, and it said that you guys qualified on the USS Shamrock Bay. Does that sound right?
I don't know that. But I put down the list of all the carriers I was on, but I don't know that name.
So the first carrier on your list was the Corregidor. Was that where you carrier qualified?
Yeah, that's where I carrier qualified down off of Fort Lauderdale.
So that experience, landing aboard a carrier and an escort carrier of all things,
Yeah.
what was that like?
It was very interesting. I would say. But I took to it naturally. I didn't have any trouble with the carrier landings. Of course, I had a wonderful airplane to fly. The Grumman TBF was a super great airplane.
So, about how long were you on to Petroff Bay with VC-76?
We were scheduled. They had us all pricked. We were going to go to Japan. We were going to support the Marine landings on Japan. So we had done our qualifying landings. We had to, every time you changed or went somewhere, you had to requalify on the carrier. And so we had requalified on the Petroff Bay. And we were going to ride her to support the Marines landing on the main island of Japan. And we were all ready to go, you know, when they dropped the bomb.
Okay, so I think what's happened here is I didn't know when you got into VC-76. So most of the material I had prepared was actually the deployment before that.
Yeah.
So that's going to make my questions seem a little bit more disjointed than they would have been otherwise. Do you remember any of the personnel who were in the squadron at that point after it reformed?
No, I don't. Unfortunately, we were always so brief and we were moved around so much that I don't remember anybody, no.
What about your enlisted air crew? Do you remember who flew with you in the plane?
Yeah, I remember them. One was a French Canadian and from upstate New York, and the other one was the son of a bartender in Boston. I remember both of them very well. The guy from Boston was named Latimer, and the guy from upstate New York was Boisvert, Boisvert. They were my two crewmen, Latimer and Boisvert.
And which one was the radioman and which one was your ordnanceman? Do you remember that?
The little guy, Boisvert, was the ball turret gunner that had to punch up in the ball turret. And Latimer was my radioman and the stinger gunner of the turkey.
And would you say that you got along fairly well with your crew throughout the time you were together?
We did get along. They were so supportive of me, you know, yeah, they were terrific. I like when we'd land and I would slide off of a stub wing, you know, and a lot of times when I'd hit the deck, I'd kind of lose and these two guys would grab me and hang on to me, you know, and I never forgot it. I thought they were wonderful, very supportive.
All right, so at this point I'm going to be referring to the card you handed me because it looks like most of the information I'm going to need is actually going to come from that because I couldn't really find what happened to you after the war ended. So let's pick up from there. How did you decide, first of all, that you wanted to stay in the Navy once the war ended? Make a career out of it?
I didn't have anything to look forward to by going back to Ohio. I had spent most of my time out in the California area, you know, or Seattle. I flew out of Seattle, Washington, out of Coos Bay, Oregon. So I just seemed like an interesting place to be. So I didn't really contemplate doing anything that required me to get out of the Navy and look for another job. It just seemed like it was much easier for me to stay in the Navy, and especially if they wanted me, I guess. And the Navy treated me very well, you know. So I just sort of stayed because it was the easiest thing for me to do because I fitted in. I was doing everything I needed to do.
So I see after VC-76's deployment was prematurely ended, you got a string of carriers and squadrons. So at what point were you in BT-18? What carrier was that?
That VC-18 was the big air group, and that was the Petroff Bay. Of course, we qualified for the carrier, but of course, we had our aircraft loaded on the carrier to go to Japan to support the Marine landing on Japan. Of course, that didn't happen, so we didn't really proceed on the Petroff because the war ended, you know.
Now I've got to ask you, because you had spent all that time training and preparing yourself for combat, and then you didn't get to go because you must have felt relief, but was there also some disappointment that you had spent all that time preparing?
I was disappointed because I wanted to do something significant. You know, I wanted to sink a battleship, or since I was a torpedo plane pilot and we dropped a lot of practice torpedoes, I wanted to run in on a big enemy ship and put a torpedo into them. And I look forward to doing that, but of course the war ended because they really spent a lot of time training us to drop torpedoes. So you had to, getting the torpedo in the water to run properly was quite a job. You couldn't be too high when you dropped them, and you couldn't be too low. You couldn't be in the skid. You had to. So they trained a lot, training us to drop torpedoes properly. And I thought it was very interesting. I couldn't wait, to put a torpedo into a big ship.
Well, what about the other people that you were serving with when you all got the news that the war was ending? What was the attitude with everybody around you at that time?
Yeah, everybody seemed happy that the war was over, and they wanted to go and continue their whatever they were doing before, But I was not really ever doing anything significant other than riding horseback, training horses. And so I had gone back, and the polo coach at Ohio State University had seen my sister and I riding horseback on the fields, and he approached my father and asked if I would like to join the polo team for Ohio State. And of course, then when the war ended, they dropped the polo. They couldn't afford that anymore. But they wanted me to play polo for them because I had spent a lot of time on horseback.
So had he made those inquiries with you before the war started, playing polo, or like when did they contact you about that?
It was after the war.
Right after the war.
Yeah.
Okay. So now I see here on your card that you did spend some time on the old USS Ranger, which I know wasn't around too terribly long after the war ended.
I went through the Panama Canal on the Ranger. Yeah. She had a bent prop. And when you sat down in the wardroom to eat, stuff on the table just went like this because she had a bad prop. But we went through the Panama on the Ranger.
What was that like? Because I know a lot of people, the first time they ever saw the canal, they were just kind of blown away.
It was very interesting, There were a lot of ships lined up waiting to take the turn to go through the canal. And so, but the Navy had priority, and so we'd kind of go to the head of the line, to get in the transit the canal. I thought it was very interesting, to see all the stuff involved in going through the canal.
So at that point, it looks like your career starts to move toward the anti-submarine pipeline.
That's right, yeah.
But it looks like you started off in fixed wing ASW. Were you flying Guardians at that point? What were you flying?
We were still flying the TBF. They rigged her to drop sonobuoys, and so we were trained to drop sonobuoys in a pattern to chase submarines. So we spent a lot of time training to handle the submarine business. we were always listed as ASW, you know.
Did you ever have to fly the version of the TBM that had the big bulbous radar on the underside, or was
Yes,
that?
I did. I liked flying it because you couldn't get lost. You know, that big radar dome, we could pick up a pop bottle in the water 20 miles away. And we all liked flying the big thing because with it you didn't get lost. And you could always find the carrier because it was the biggest blip on the screen, you know. So we liked flying the big guppy, we called it.
So did you have to fly the Guardian at any point, or did you go straight from the TBMs to helicopters?
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Well, I thought that helicopters had a future in the Navy, and so I called my detailer and said I'd like to be sent to helicopter training. Well, they tried like mad to talk me out of it. They said that helicopters weren't going to go anywhere in the Navy, and that I was going to ruin my career if I kept on insisting I wanted to go into the helicopter training. The Navy detailers spent a lot of phone calls trying to talk me out of going into helicopters. They thought that was a dead end, and they didn't have any regard for helicopters, and they thought I was kind of screwy by even saying, gee, I'd like to go through helicopter training, you know. They said, what do you want to do that for? You'll ruin your career.
Well, I know you said you thought there was a future in it, but what about the helicopter led you to that conclusion? Like, what did you think?
It seemed like you could do so much with it, you know. You could hover, and we had dipping sonar, you know. We'd hover and drop the ball down to chase submarines, you know. It just seemed like it was so versatile that you could do so much with it, you know.
So at that time, how did they train you from the transition to fixed wing to rotary? Like what process did you have to go through?
We went through a program at Pensacola, and we flew the Little Bell helicopters, you know, and got qualified as a helicopter pilot by flying the Little Bell, which was really easy.
So when you finished your rotary training and you were ready to go on to actually flying like helicopters for anti-submarine warfare, what sort of models were you flying at that point?
Well, we flew it was HRS. It was Sikorsky, the big Sikorsky aircraft, and that was the plane that they used for ASW at that time. That's the one I went in the water in. I put one of them in the water.
Well, we'll come back to that. The first helo squadron you have on your list is HS-4, so was that your first helicopter squadron?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Where were they when you reported?
That was at Ream Field, south of San Diego. The field butted right up on the Mexican border. Ream, R-E-A-M, Ream Field. So we were there.
So I'm trying to sort of follow both of your lists because you've got your squadrons on one side and your carriers on the other. What deployments did you do with HS-4? Did you go to a carrier at that point?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Let's see. After Ranger, you have Sicily, Saipan, Mindoro, Siboney, and then you have the Roosevelt, which was a much bigger carrier. It doesn't say when you started in the Korean War, but I know did you actually have to make a deployment during the Korean War?
I asked for duty in Korea. I volunteered for duty, and I was appointed in the headquarters in downtown Seoul, and we designated targets for carrier squadrons coming in to attack Korea. So I spent, I forget how long I was there, but that's what we were doing. We would get a call from some Marine unit on the front line and saying, well, we're having trouble here, could you send a flight of aircraft in to give us close air support? And that's what we did. We would take calls from the people right in the trenches right up front, and they would ask for air support. And that's what we did. We would fly and do stuff for them and harass the enemy.
So your next other squadron was HS-5. Was that still during Korea, or was that after?
No, that was afterwards. Yeah, that was that was one of the squadrons I commanded, HS-5, and the other one I commanded was HS-13. HS-5 and 13, I commanded both of them.
So could you explain the change in, I guess, your mentality once you go from being just a pilot in the squadron to being the commanding officer? Like what it was like?
It was easy, you know. I thought, you know, you had to be an example, and you had to be very careful with your behavior, and you know, I thought that being a commanding officer, you had to really not do anything that would smirch the Navy any, you know. We felt strongly that we had to really do well because we owed it to the Navy.
So the squadrons that you commanded, were they both Atlantic or Pacific?
They were both out of Quonset Point, Rhode Island. Yeah.
And did you do any deployments with either of them, like on a carrier, or was it mostly ashore?
We made frequent trips from the Quonset area, where the two carriers were the Lake Champlain and the Essex, that we would go out on cruises on, and we had a long cruise in the European area on the Essex, and it was very interesting because we did a lot of work with the destroyers. You know, we would carry the preacher on Sundays. We would carry him and put him on various destroyers that were in the screen. You know, and it was always very interesting. You know, going and landing on. We didn't really land. We hovered right on the fantail of the destroyers and put the preacher down on a sling on the gun turret. So it was very interesting, I thought.
Now, you did mention earlier that you did have an experience where you put one of your helicopters in the water.
Yeah.
Well, what happened there?
Well, it was a hot, sunny day and no wind, and I was flying co-pilot, actually, and we had a guy who had a little more experience than me was the pilot, but we went into the hover, and there was no wind. It was a real hot day, and he let his RPM get down on him, and he tried to recover, and he couldn't recover. We hit the water and rolled over upside down, and I was in the co-pilot seat, so when we rolled over, I just swam out of the cockpit. And that's when the pilot, the big guy, big Irishman, he was in a rubber raft. He and the crewman got out, and he was sitting in the rubber raft, and I swam over to see how he was, and I put my hand on the raft, and it flipped him. And he got back up in the raft, and I started swimming, and he said, Jack, don't try to help me anymore.
And so was that the only time in your career you ever had a dunking?
Yeah, that's the only time, yeah. We put a helo in the water, and I swam right out of it. I didn't get pulled down like the main pilot sitting on the right of the plane rolled over upside down, and he and the crewman went down with it for a while. I was worried that they weren't going to get out of it. But when I swam over to see how he was, he said, "Don't try to help me anymore."
All right, Captain, we've got about 4 minutes left on this thing. I see on your card that you actually did some time on the Canadian aircraft carrier Bonaventure. How did that happen?
I landed on it because they wanted me to take the skipper and show him how we can dip our sonar, how we can hover, but they didn't have that, and the skipper wanted to see what it was like to hover and put the sonar dome down in the helicopter. So I was just briefly on the carrier picking up the skipper to take him out and show him how the sonar dome worked, on the Venture.
And the last thing I see listed on your flight log profile is that you ended up at Navair Syscom and you were in charge of the helo desk. How did that happen?
They found out that I was, at the time, the senior person with all the qualifications to have the job. So they contacted me and said, "We got a job for you." Okay. I said, okay.
Were there any things you were involved with at Navair Syscom that were particularly noteworthy? Any sort of projects or technology?
Yeah, they were always doing a lot of stuff at the time on ASW. They were trying to improve their ability to handle chasing submarines, and all the stuff, the sonar equipment on board the destroyers, and so they were trying to improve that. They realized that so far they didn't have the best handle on this sort of a program to chase submarines.
Was it difficult for you in terms of I guess the level of excitement that you were having to go into one of those high level administrative jobs where you had to worry about that kind of thing? Did you miss being away from the squadron? And
no, it didn't really bother me. No, it was easy. I didn't. It didn't bother me. No.
So I'm going to wrap up the video portion of this just because I've got, it looks like a minute left. When did you actually retire from the Navy?
In 75.
75.
On the 1st of July of 75.
And did you do anything else after that, or you retired for good?
Just retired. Well, my wife was in business. She had an antique business, an antique shop, and so I spent a lot of time helping her, because she got really involved in the handling and selling and buying antiques. So I ended up busy helping her at very low pay.
All right, well, I'm going to stop the video here and we'll continue recording the audio separately.